Today, under the scope, I take a look at Fate Stay Night 2006, the anime adaptation of the first route of the 2004 visual novel of the— Wait, what? Hold up. Arage? If you were to write a book on how not to adapt a visual novel to anime, you would use Studio Deen's 2006 adaptation of Fate Stay Night as your guide. I'll give it a little bit of slack because it's not like adapting a visual novel is easy. Note, I said a little bit. The Fate Stay Night visual novel is made up of 3 routes. Fate, which is the most basic and generic shonen of the 3, Unlimited Blade Works, which focuses on facing oneself and one's ideals, and Heaven's Feel, the mindfuck of them all. Studio Deen decided to mostly adapt the Fate route, the least interesting of the 3, but a necessary introduction to the world and characters. I say mostly because they tried to blend some of the plot points from the other 2 routes into it, which just didn't work at all. Any VN reader will tell you that if you want the best version of the story, at least when it comes to the Fate route, read the visual novel, screw the anime. But since most of you probably don't want to spend the 80 plus hours it takes to read the damn thing, you're stuck with this. With my overall opinion about this series abundantly clear by now, and it's not very good, a few questions still remain. Just how bad do I think it is, and is it worth watching? While I've probably made it sound like this is the shittiest anime in existence so far, it's not that bad and definitely has its merits. Fate Stay Night is the story of the 5th Holy Grail War, a battle royale fought between 7 masters and 7 servants in order to obtain the omnipotent wish-granting device that is the Holy Grail. Shiro Emiya is your typical everyday guy with a very remedial background as a mage. The then everything changes moment comes when he stumbles upon a battle between 2 servants and accidentally summons one of his own, a beautiful girl named Saber. On the surface, the story is quite simple. The Grail chooses 7 mages to fight in the war, each summoning a heroic spirit from legends past to fight for them. The last duo left standing is declared the winner and allowed to have their wish granted by the Grail. Of course, once you get into it, it becomes much more complicated. There are a ton of nuances about the rules and inner workings of the war to understand, and it can certainly get overwhelming at times. The series does do a solid job explaining all the stuff you need to know, and I never actually found myself confused at any point. This series has several fairly shocking plot twists related to the nature of the war and the participants themselves, which constantly threw me for a loop. As I mentioned before, the show takes the most boring and bland route from the visual novel, while trying to mix in plot points from the other arcs. The end result is a bit of a mess and a pretty generic plot. While the setup is unique, its execution is anything but. The main character is as standard shonen as it gets, and the show slips into a Servant of the Week setup that ultimately makes this Grail War feel much smaller than that of Fate Zero. Instead of the intricate, multi-layered, grandiose affair we saw in Fate Zero, here we get a fight that completely revolves around the main character and feels more like a checklist than an actual war. Giving credit where credit's due, the pacing was solid. If only the writing weren't so cliché and cringy. Or the plot was more cohesive and entertaining. Or it wasn't so generic. I think you get the idea. My biggest issue with this adaptation has to be the main protagonist, Shiro Emiya. He is as frustratingly cliché as it gets. His traumatic backstory is never fully explored, and he doesn't really see any actual growth or change over the course of the whole series. I know, this is all meant to be reserved for the Unlimited Blade Works route, but nevertheless makes this a poor standalone series. While this may not have been their intention, Shiro's refusal to let Saber fight for him ends up coming across as very sexist. His reasoning is that women should not be fighting, and while I get that this could be viewed as sweet in some sort of way, I just found it offensive at times. Oh, and did I mention that he's also a fucking idiot? I mean, what kind of moron has an incredibly powerful warrior at their disposal, only to not let her fight? Shiro invents a new kind of stupid with his bullheaded, stubborn, and surprisingly not fatal approach to the Grail War. Not even the strongest of servants could break through the plot armor, keeping this dumbass alive. The only other two characters of note are Shiro's servant Saber and fellow master Rin Tosaka. Each of the three routes to the visual novel has a different female heroine and romantic interest for Shiro. For the Fate route, this is Saber. She's got one of my favorite character designs in all of anime, and she's easily the best character in this series. She gets the most development, and her growth by the end is immeasurable. My only qualm with her character has more to do with how the show chooses to use her. Way too often they belittle her for being a woman, and she's unfortunately stuck with the most incompetent bastard in the entire fucking universe. I can't even imagine what it would be like if she had been teamed up with a master who isn't a complete idiot, like Rin, for example. Speaking of Rin, while I love her character, I really don't understand her motivation in this series. As the main heroine of Unlimited Blade Works, most of her development is reserved for that route, but in this series, it really doesn't make any sense for her to team up with Shiro. Well, other than some potential romantic feelings that are never developed, again, wait for UBW. But it's pretty stupid to ally yourself with the most incompetent player in the game. On the other hand, maybe she knew about his trump card, plot armor, and knew that'd keep her safe. Damn, Rin's a fucking genius! The rest of the masters and servants are each interesting, if somewhat underdeveloped. Their backstories are at least teased throughout the series, and as someone who already knew a lot of mythology coming in, I found several of the servants' stories and motivations fascinating. Unfortunately, you may need to do a bit of your own research to really get into it. Overall, Fate Stay Night has a solid cast of characters that is definitely dragged down by the MC, but is still enjoyable. At the time of its release, Fate Stay Night's animation may have been considered some of the best. Unfortunately, it has not aged well at all, especially when you stack it up against the ufotable entries in the franchise. Everything about the animation, from the backgrounds to the action sequences, is incredibly meh. Oh, and then there's this god-awful CG dragon. How could I talk about the visuals without bringing up this monstrosity? I mean, look at that thing, it's fucking atrocious! The visual novel has a few sex scenes, and the anime unsurprisingly chose to take those out. In the novel, the act is used as a means of mana transfer, but rather than just implying what happens, the anime decided to throw in this awful CG dragon instead. Great job, Deen! Perhaps the biggest bright spot in this anime is the soundtrack. Kenji Kawai, who also did the music for Ghost in the Shell, produced a really good soundtrack for this anime. A lot of the tracks do sound similar and eventually get a bit repetitive from overuse, but several of them are quite memorable. The soundtrack fits the atmosphere of the story very well. The only opening or ending worthy of note to me is the first opening, Disillusion, which is actually a remix of the opening from the visual novel. Like the soundtrack, it does an excellent job setting the mood for the show. For all of its problems, Studio Deen's Fate Stay Night adaptation is a fairly decent introduction into the world of Fate, mainly because it explains the basics in an easily understandable way. While some of the characters in the soundtrack are quite good, the story and protagonist are as generic shonen as it gets, which can get very tedious at times. Ultimately, it comes down to this: should you watch it? Well, yes and no. It depends entirely on whether you want the full story of the Fate franchise or not. Remember, this series is the only way to see the Fate route without reading the visual novel. It's a fish-out-of-water story, and definitely should be watched first if you're going to at all. This series doesn't even hold a candle to the other entries in the franchise, so watching it after the others will only leave you bitterly disappointed. So with that, I give Fate Stay Night 2006 an approval rating of pass, and an overall score of 2.5 CG dragons out of 5. While it is the least complex and most easily understandable of the Fate series, its numerous faults keep it from being worth your time unless you really want the full story. If you're looking for something similar to Fate Stay Night, check out Shakugan no Shana for an action-packed show and a heavy shonen plotline that has a lot of similar elements to Fate. Also take a look at Future Diary for a more traditional battle royale with a darker tone that more closely resembles that of the ufotable type Moonworks. That's all for me. If you have any questions regarding Fate Stay Night, leave them in the comments below and I'll be happy to respond. Please subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and as always, thanks for watching. See you next time.